The original marriage certificate still rests in the Louisiana State Archives. Fragile and faded, bearing the names of Jeremiah Aldrich and Celeste, who was listed not as a wife, but as property beneath his signature. What makes this paper so haunting isn't only the forced union of a plantation owner and his enslaved cook, but the strange wave of 13 deaths that followed within months of their March 1854 wedding. Newspapers of the time, preserved in private hands, whispered about a conspiracy so ruthless and carefully hidden that officials quietly smothered the investigation to shield Louisiana's most powerful families. Behind that marriage lay a story of betrayal, revenge, and cruelty, so shocking it unsettled even the hardened world of the antebellum South. Before we return to the dark fate that awaited Jeremiah Aldrich at Willowbrook Plantation, make sure to subscribe and drop a comment with the state you're listening from. Now let's step back into a time when honor was everything, and a broken bond could ruin a man more completely than death itself. The chain of events that led to that grim wedding began 15 years earlier in the shadowed swamps of the Mississippi Delta, where fortunes were carved out of flesh and blood, and where money ran as thick as the river's mud. Jeremiah Aldrich wasn't born into the aristocracy of Louisiana's plantation class. He was the son of a failed Kentucky tobacco farmer who arrived in New Orleans in 1839 with little more than ambition and a willingness to dive into the dirtiest corners of commerce. The Creole elite looked down on the slave trade, even as their wealth depended on it, preferring to pretend their riches flowed from sugar and cotton, not from the buying and selling of human lives. In the suffocating summer of 1840, Aldrich found allies in Marcus Devo and Samuel Rochelle, two desperate men with as much hunger as himself. Devo, the youngest son of a declining sugar dynasty, needed fast money to save his family's plantation. Rochelle, a disgraced ship captain, ruined by fever and failed ventures, carried rare knowledge of the illegal slave routes from Cuba and the Caribbean. Together they founded the Delta Trading Company, operating out of a warehouse at the edge of New Orleans, where the law turned a blind eye and questions were never asked about cargo. Their business thrived not on the official paper-stamp trade, but on what they called recovery services, buying back runaways, trafficking kidnapped free blacks, and most profitably smuggling fresh captives off outlawed Atlantic ships. The profits were staggering because they spent almost nothing on the people they sold. For 3 years, the partnership thrived in the shadows, and each man used his gains to buy a veneer of respectability. Devo saved and expanded his family plantation. Rochelle built a fleet of riverboats and earned the title of shipping magnate, and Aldrich purchased Willowbrook Plantation, a prosperous cotton estate complete with a stately mansion that signaled his entry into Louisiana's planter elite. Success had made them sloppy, and that carelessness put them in the crosshairs of men who carried real authority. By the spring of 1843, word spread that federal marshals were sniffing around the Gulf Coast looking into whispers of illegal slave trading. Investigators were combing through shipping manifests, tracing irregular payments, and worst of all, tracking down people who had slipped through the cracks of bondage and lived to tell what they knew. Panic drove the three partners into a hasty meeting inside Aldrich's grand study at Willowbrook. The room itself felt like a lie. Shelves lined with books. He couldn't read portraits of ancestors who weren't his blood. Everything staged to convince others he belonged among Louisiana's planter aristocracy. The atmosphere was suffocating. Devo, jittery as always, urged them to cut their losses, burn the records and scatter before the law closed in. Rochelle, hardened by years at sea, leaned toward patience, move their wealth offshore, ride out the investigation, then resume business once the marshals turned their attention elsewhere. But Aldrich had already crossed into darker territory. He didn't see an investigation as a threat to all three of them. He saw it as an opportunity to free himself from partners who could one day expose him. His solution was chilling in its simplicity. He would kill them both, then spin the murders into the story of a partnership destroyed by greed. He would emerge as the sole survivor, the man forced into a bloody self-defense, the one left to shoulder the burden while quietly pocketing their fortune. The stage was set for June of that year, on a sticky summer night, when the air itself seemed to drip with menace. The warehouse that had served as their headquarters for 3 years was nearly deserted after dark and marked for demolition within weeks. It was the perfect grave for a partnership. Aldrich arrived first, the weight of a concealed pistol in his coat and a hunting knife tucked in his boot. His script was rehearsed: shoot Devo quickly, then turn the knife on Rochelle in a staged brawl that left them both dead. He'd even arranged a supporting cast, 3 dockhands paid to swear they'd seen Devo and Rochelle fighting over missing funds earlier that day. By the time his partners walked in, Aldrich had already set the scene. A bottle of whiskey gleamed in the lamplight, 3 glasses waiting ledgers, stacked high like props on a stage. At first the meeting unfolded like dozens before it, with Devo nervously detailing the marshal's inquiries and Rochelle laying out a plan to funnel their money into Havana banks where no American court could reach. But as the whiskey flowed, Aldrich guided the talk toward their hidden reserves, pushing for details, pressing them harder with each question. Rochelle's weathered instincts finally caught the shift. He leaned back, narrowed his eyes, and in that instant, he knew something about this night was not what it seemed. Rochelle's seafaring instincts, sharpened by years spent in rough ports and treacherous waters, caught the subtle betrayals in Aldrich's behavior. His eyes flickered away, too often his hand lingered near his coat pocket. His voice strained as he pressed for details about bank accounts and secret reserves. When Rochelle suggested postponing the meeting and bringing in lawyers the next day, Aldrich realized he was running out of time. Violence erupted with brutal swiftness. Aldrich pulled his pistol and fired into Devo's chest before the younger man could even rise from his chair. The gunshot cracked through the cavernous warehouse, and Devo collapsed, blood blooming across his shirt, as his expression froze in stunned betrayal. But Rochelle was not so easy to kill. The old sailor hurled the heavy table aside and came at Aldrich with a jagged whiskey bottle, carving a deep gash across his cheek that would scar him for life. The fight that followed was chaos. They slammed into crates, toppled ledgers, and left bloody smears across the warehouse as they grappled over Aldrich's knife. Rochelle fought with the fury of a man who knew exactly what was happening and would not die quietly. For nearly 10 minutes, the struggle raged far longer than Aldrich's plan had accounted for. In the end, age betrayed Rochelle. His strength gave way, and Aldrich drove the blade into his gut, twisting upward toward the heart as the sailor clawed at his throat. Even as he bled out, Rochelle managed to rasp words that would haunt Aldrich forever. "My son knows everything. He'll come for you. When he's old enough, he'll make you pay." Aldrich dismissed it as the delirium of a dying man, blind to the fact that Marcus Devo's younger brother Phipe had quietly documented their crimes, and that Rochelle's teenage son, Henri, carried intimate knowledge of every deal, every bribe, every shipment the Delta Trading Company had ever made. For 4 long hours after the killings, Aldrich staged his masterpiece. He positioned Devo's body to look like he'd been shot while reaching for a weapon, placed Rochelle with knife in hand as though he had struck the fatal blow, and scattered money across the floor to hint at greed-driven violence. He battered the office safe, cut his own arms and hands to sell his role as an innocent survivor, and ensured the scene told a story no investigator would question. The dockside witnesses played their part, swearing that Devo and Rochelle had argued bitterly that day. A corrupt laborer claimed he'd heard the shouting, the gunshot, and the sounds of a brutal struggle. Aldrich told police he'd come to mediate, but had stumbled into a bloodbath, forced to defend himself. The New Orleans police, drowning in bigger cases and unwilling to tarnish the reputation of men who passed for respectable businessmen, accepted the tale with barely a glance. Their report concluded that Devo and Rochelle had destroyed each other in a dispute with Aldrich, surviving by sheer luck. A week later, the warehouse was torn down as planned, taking with it the last traces of evidence. Freed from his partners and flush with their stolen fortunes, Aldrich wasted no time. Forged documents established him as the rightful surviving owner. And banks that once hesitated over 3 shadowy traders now trusted a rising plantation master with a growing cotton estate. One by one, he drained the accounts, emptied safe deposit boxes, and seized the hidden caches of cash his partners had left behind. By the year's end, Jeremiah Aldrich had erased the Delta Trading Company and replaced it with a fortune that wore the mask of legitimacy. By Aldrich's own tally, the spoils came to nearly $40,000, a fortune that in today's money would climb past $1 million. He believed he had not only erased the Delta Trading Company, but also buried every threat to his new identity as a wealthy, respectable planter. What he failed to see was that the families of the men he had betrayed and murdered were still very much alive, and some of them were far more dangerous than he ever imagined. Philippe Devo was only 22 when his older brother Marcus was killed. But unlike the impulsive Devo men who came before him, Philippe was patient, calculating, and ruthlessly intelligent. He had been Marcus's confidant, quietly running the books and maintaining meticulous ledgers of the Delta Trading Company's dealings. Hidden in those records were coded notations of illegal slave purchases, shipping manifests from forbidden Caribbean routes, and letters from bribed officials who had smoothed the way for their operations. Philippe had also been skeptical of Aldrich from the very beginning. The Kentuckian's eagerness to dive into the bloodiest aspects of the trade struck him as reckless, and he had already begun investigating Aldrich's background before the murders, uncovering inconsistencies in his personal history and suspicious movements of money that hinted at motives beyond simple greed. So when word of Marcus's death reached the Devo plantation, Philippe's reaction wasn't paralyzing grief. It was cold fury. The official story made no sense to anyone who knew the 3 men. Marcus, though desperate for cash, was too cautious to provoke a deadly confrontation. Rochelle, despite his rough edges, relied on negotiation and strategy, not drunken knife fights. And most damning, Aldrich's account of the night contained references to funds that Philippe knew had already been moved weeks earlier. Within days of the funeral, Philippe launched his own investigation. He leaned on his brother's old contacts along the docks, sifted through shipping ledgers, and bribed police clerks for access to the official report. What he uncovered stripped away any lingering doubt. The crime scene had been manipulated from top to bottom. Witnesses had been bribed to lie, physical evidence had conveniently disappeared, and the timeline of Aldrich's actions made it clear that he had begun seizing his partner's assets within hours of their deaths. This wasn't a man who stumbled into violence. It was a man who had orchestrated it. And Philippe, unlike his brother, had no intention of letting him get away with it. Henri Rochelle's investigation began on a very different track from Philippe's. At 24, the son of a murdered sailor carried his father's network of maritime contacts, but paired them with the sharp edge of a formal education in business and law. Unlike Philippe, who pursued truth through dockside whispers and bribed officials, Henri moved within the polished world of ledgers and contracts. He had spent years working in banks and shipping firms around New Orleans, cultivating relationships with clerks, brokers, and managers who could quietly slip him the kind of information that never appeared in public records. What he uncovered was staggering. By piecing together account transfers, property deeds, and shipping manifests, Henri documented how Jeremiah Aldrich had stripped more than $60,000 worth of assets from his murdered partners, a mountain of wealth built on years of misery and blood. What made Henri particularly dangerous was not just his ability to follow the money, but his grasp of how Louisiana's financial and legal systems truly operated. He understood that the courts were corrupt, and that a man like Aldrich could always buy his way out of formal justice. Rather than rushing toward confrontation, Henri devised a longer game. He would turn Aldrich's greed and recklessness into weapons, dismantling his financial stability piece by piece until the plantation master found himself cornered and exposed. In the fall of 1844, over a year after the murders, Henri and Philippe Deveau finally met in a discreet restaurant in the French Quarter. Each had set out to avenge his family alone, but they quickly realized how perfectly their paths aligned. Philippe brought hard evidence and access to Louisiana's social circles. Henri brought financial expertise and banking influence. By spring of 1845, their investigations had fused into a carefully engineered conspiracy. Their strategy mirrored Aldrich's own methods, betrayal manipulation, and eventual violence, but unlike his impulsive brutality, theirs would be deliberate, patient, and mercilessly precise. The first phase was infiltration. Philippe used his charm and his family's old connections to slip into Aldrich's orbit. He appeared at the same gentlemen's clubs, the same political gatherings, and the same lavish parties, slowly becoming a familiar face. He played the role of a friendly acquaintance, someone Aldrich could drink with, but never suspect of harboring a grudge. Henri, meanwhile, worked from the shadows, using his ties to the banking world to probe every weakness in Aldrich's empire. What he found was gold. Aldrich's fortune was not as solid as it appeared. His plantation profits masked a fragile financial structure propped up by loans and risky investments. Even worse, Aldrich had developed a ruinous gambling habit, bleeding thousands of dollars at poker tables and racetracks, debts he covered by borrowing against future cotton harvests. That weakness gave Henri and Philippe their opening. By 1848, Henri had secured a trusted position at First National Bank of New Orleans, the very institution that held the mortgage on Willowbrook Plantation. From within its walls, he began to tighten the screws, slightly higher interest rates, here adjusted, repayment schedules there, small, almost invisible changes that nudged Aldrich toward financial instability. Every planting season became more precarious, every harvest a little less profitable, and with each passing year, Jeremiah Aldrich stepped closer to the edge, unaware that the men he had once dismissed as powerless heirs were orchestrating his downfall. By 1851, Aldrich's world was already crumbling, though he was too blinded by pride and desperation to see how carefully his ruin had been orchestrated. Philippe had slipped him into the city's most exclusive gambling dens, where the tables were rigged and the odds stacked so that Aldrich bled money every time he played. Henri, from behind the polished counters of First National Bank, tightened the screws on his loans until the interest alone devoured his profits. Together, their plan was slow, deliberate, and devastating. Aldrich's debts swelled to nearly $30,000. His reputation began to crack, and whispers of Willowbrook's decline spread across Louisiana society. Yet for Philippe and Henri, financial ruin was only the foundation. They wanted Aldrich to feel humiliation as raw and unbearable as the terror their fathers had endured in the warehouse. They wanted him alive, trapped, stripped of dignity, and forced to endure the weight of his own corruption before death finally came for him. It was Henri who conceived the cruelest stroke. Every planter lived under the shadow of rebellion, knowing that the enslaved people who worked their fields might one day turn against them. That fear, Henri reasoned, could be used as a weapon. Not through an actual uprising, too dangerous, too indiscriminate, but through something far subtler, forcing Aldrich into a marriage that would shatter his standing in the eyes of his peers and bind him to a fate he could neither control nor escape. The plan required the perfect choice of bride, someone whose presence would wound Aldrich's pride, annihilate his reputation, and leave him exposed to ridicule and ruin. They found her in Celeste, the head cook at Willowbrook. At 38, she was formidable, but her value to their scheme went far beyond appearances. She was shrewd, deeply pragmatic, and above all, she despised Jeremiah Aldrich with a passion that burned hotter than any vengeance Philippe or Henri could devise. Purchased in 1847 from a failing Mississippi plantation, Celeste had been torn from her husband and 3 children, each sold off to different owners in different states. The wound never healed, and she carried her grief like a sharpened blade. Unlike so many who masked their hatred with obedience, Celeste allowed hers to gleam through her eyes whenever Aldrich was near. She followed orders, kept the kitchen running, and never gave him cause for punishment. But beneath the surface, her contempt was a storm waiting for release. For Philippe and Henri, Celeste was the keystone of their design. By binding Aldrich to her in the sanctity of marriage, an act both grotesque and legally binding, they would not only destroy his fragile social standing, but ensure that every humiliation he suffered came from within his own household. This was not simply revenge. It was poetic justice, a reckoning crafted with patience, precision, and a cruelty equal to his own. Aldrich could have bought Celeste's whole family, but he chose only her because he needed a good cook and figured children were extra mouths to feed. When she begged him to buy her 10-year-old daughter, he sneered that he ran a plantation, not an orphanage. For 7 years, she cooked for the man who had torn her family apart, serving him fine meals while she lived on scraps, watching him brag about fortunes built on stolen money and murdered partners, cleaning blood from his clothes after late-night trips and burning papers in the kitchen hearth. When his debts got worse, over time, she learned everything about him: what he liked to eat, which medicines he took for his stomach, which rooms he favored, the rhythm of his routines, and the little tells that came with his growing paranoia. That knowledge made her dangerous, and it made her invaluable to Philippe Deveau and Henri Rochelle. Philippe and Henri could not meet her directly on the plantation without raising suspicion. So they used free people of color in New Orleans markets as go-betweens, slipping Celeste small amounts of money for details, until they realized she was already quietly making his life miserable on her own, oversalting his food to aggravate his stomach, breaking his favorite dishes, seeding rumors among the enslaved people about his finances, all small acts that were deniable but effective. When they finally told her who they were and what they planned, she agreed at once to help on one condition. When it was over, she wanted her freedom and safe passage to Canada so she could try to find her children. Philippe and Henri agreed, and over months they stitched the last pieces of their plan together. Aldrich would be driven into ruin by rigged gambling and tightened loans until he was desperate and then presented with an impossible choice: marry Celeste in a legal ceremony that would destroy his standing or be handed over to creditors who would take everything. The marriage would humiliate him in public, give Philippe and Henri legal leverage through his new wife, and put Celeste in the perfect position to make him suffer from inside his own household. They did not intend a quick death. They wanted him to know day by day that his power was gone, and that the prosperity he had built on other people's lives was a lie. Celeste, who had hated him from the start, would be both instrument and avenger, and in return she would earn the one thing Aldrich could never buy back for her: a chance to be free, and a hope of finding the children he had sold away. The trap closed on Jeremiah Aldrich in February of 1854 with a kind of precision that only years of patience and planning could produce. By then, he was clinging to Willowbrook by his fingernails, borrowing against future harvests, pawning off enslaved people, even selling prized furniture to scrape together the money he carried in a worn leather satchel that night, $8,000, the last liquid wealth he possessed. He walked into the gambling den on the waterfront, thinking he had one final chance to claw his way back from ruin, unaware that every card, every glance, every sip of whiskey had already been arranged against him. The warehouse-turned-gaming hall was thick with smoke sweat and the sour tang of spilled liquor, its rafters echoing with the laughter of men who played not just for money, but for dominance. Fog from the river pressed against the windows so dense it blurred the line between reality and nightmare. The game was 5-card stud with stakes so high each hand could make or break a fortune. At first, Aldrich won just enough to believe fate had finally turned. His pile of chips grew and shrank like a living thing feeding his desperate hope. Each small victory drew him deeper, and with every drink, every reckless bet, he convinced himself he was on the edge of salvation. By midnight, half his money was gone, but he couldn't leave. The men around him, handpicked by Philippe and Henri, let him win now and then, just enough to keep him tethered to the table while slowly bleeding him dry. The air grew heavier as the hours passed, thick with the stench of sweat and cigar smoke, the fog outside pressing closer like a shroud. By 2 a.m, Aldrich's last $3,000 sat in front of him, trembling in his hands, like the dying embers of his fortune. The cards seemed to smile at him, a pair of kings, showing with the tantalizing promise of a full house. Convinced that Providence had finally taken his side, he shoved everything into the pot. The room fell silent as the final cards hit the table. Aldrich's kings, bold and shining, looked unbeatable until the stranger across from him revealed his hand, a full house laid down with deliberate calm. The chips slid across the table, and the man collected his winnings without a flicker of triumph, as though he had always known this was how the night would end. Aldrich sat motionless, staring at the green felt, as if he could will the cards to change the sound of laughter and coins clinking in the background, fading to a dull roar in his ears. In a single hand he had lost not just his fortune, but the last thread of control over his life. The stranger across from him spoke with a faint French lilt and an unsettling calm. Then Philippe Deveau stepped from the shadows, and the resemblance to the brother Jeremiah had watched die 11 years earlier hit him like ice. And before Aldrich could find his voice, Henri Rochelle rounded the small circle and laid a leather folder on the felt full of bank ledgers, property deeds, shipping manifests, and sworn statements that matched details Aldrich had sworn were long destroyed. The 2 men told him plainly that they knew about the Delta Trading Company. The staged warehouse scene, the bribed witnesses, the forged papers, and every crooked transfer he had made to bury the truth. And when Aldrich reached for some scrap of denial, there was no corner left to hide in because the documents were authentic and the witnesses ready enough to bring down not only him, but a roll call of men who had helped launder his stolen fortune. Philippe leaned in and said they had 2 choices for it, both designed so he could not walk away. They could hand the files to federal marshals and watch the legal noose close around everyone who had a hand in his rise. Or they could offer him a last chance that would destroy him socially and bind him legally to the very thing he had always treated as property. And Henri, folding his hands, explained the terms in a voice that left no room for bargaining. Marry Celeste in a lawful ceremony. Accept her as your wife before witnesses, and in return they would arrange a settlement that might spare your life and some semblance of estate. But the marriage would ruin your name, strip you of honor, and place your fate in the hands of the woman you betrayed or refuse. And see every forged title, every laundered dollar, and every corrupt official exposed to the federal courts. Aldrich sat with his last hopes drained away, surrounded by the living proof of the crimes he thought buried. And for the first time in years, he understood that the patience of dead men could be more relentless and more civilized than the violence he had once chosen. They could have exposed you to the city, Philippe said, or handed everything over to the marshals, Henri added. And either way, you would end up dead and disgraced. Aldrich rasped that he could get money, that his plantation still had value. But Henri cut him off and reminded him that they held the mortgages, now that every loan, every gambling IOU, every lien had been quietly moved into hands that answered to them. "You have nothing left to bargain with except your life," he said. The room felt suddenly smaller, colder as the truth settled in. Aldrich was bankrupted, isolated, and surrounded by the sons of the men he had killed. Philippe offered one last option, his voice mocking civility. There was a way to breathe for a while longer, but it would demand the surrender of his dignity and his standing. "Marry one of your slaves," he said. "Legally and publicly take Celeste as your wife, before witnesses live as her husband, and accept the social ruin that would follow. In return, they might arrange a settlement that left him alive and perhaps a fragment of estate. But the marriage would be binding and permanent." Aldrich groped for disbelief, insisting no preacher or court would recognize such a union. But Philippe smiled and said they had lined up a minister in a neighboring parish deeply indebted to the same gambling houses, and that Louisiana law would enforce a properly witnessed contract. Henri pushed the point refusal meant exposure, prosecutions, and a fate likely worse than death. Acceptance meant humiliation that would strip him of honor, but let him live under their terms. Aldrich finally asked how long the punishment would last. "For the rest of your natural life?" Philippe replied, and the unspoken addendum hung in the air, "Given your health and the way we have arranged things, that life may not be very long." They hadn't offered Aldrich a bargain that would buy him freedom. They had offered him a sentence. A slow, humiliating death masquerading as marriage, a punishment designed not just to end his life, but to hollow it out first. The alternative, a bullet in the head and his body dumped into the Mississippi under the cover of fog, seemed almost merciful by comparison. In the thick silence of that warehouse, Aldrich finally asked the question that had been gnawing at him. If he agreed, what guarantee did he have that they wouldn't simply kill him anyway? Henri's reply was ice cold. "None. But he said the manner of your death will be kinder than what we had originally prepared. Obedience would be met with small mercies. Defiance would be answered with cruelty, limited only by their imagination." Philippe produced the final insult, a marriage contract already drawn up, ready for Aldrich's trembling signature. The ceremony was scheduled for the next evening at Willowbrook itself, before neighbors and business associates who had been told he had undergone a religious awakening and now sought to elevate a slave to the role of wife as a gesture of Christian charity. The trap was elegant in its cruelty. He would not only marry Celeste, but do so under the guise of benevolence, ensuring that no one suspected coercion. To the world, it would look like his choice, his eccentricity, his shame. With hands shaking so violently he could barely grip the quill, Aldrich signed away his last shred of control. The contract bound him to live with Celeste as his wife, to provide for her as he would any spouse, and in return, his creditors now, nothing more than Philippe and Henri's agents, would delay collection long enough for him to continue running Willowbrook under their thumb. Aldrich told himself he might find a way out later, that perhaps he could appeal to the law, escape across state lines, or dig up some technicality to nullify the marriage. But even as those thin hopes passed through his mind, he saw the satisfaction in his tormentor's eyes. They had been waiting for this moment for over a decade. Every escape route he imagined had already been sealed shut. "Welcome to the family, brother-in-law," Philippe said, scooping up the signed contract with a smile that was both triumphant and mocking. "We'll see you tomorrow evening. Dress well. It's an important day." The morning of March 15th, 1854, arrived under a sky swollen with heavy gray clouds. The air thick and fetid with the smell of swamp decay. Jeremiah Aldrich had not slept. He had spent the long hours pacing the floors of his grand house, pausing again and again to stare at the piece of paper that had ended him more thoroughly than any bullet could. 15 years of blood betrayal and stolen fortune had brought him to this: a wedding he could not refuse, a wife he could not escape, and a fate more terrifying than death. Celeste had been told of the arrangement days before, but when Aldrich tried to explain it over breakfast, mumbling about obligations, debts, and religious conviction, she played the part flawlessly. She listened as if humoring a nervous child, then answered with quiet composure, "Yes, Master Aldrich. I understand. I'll prepare myself for the ceremony." The calm certainty in her voice unsettled him more than any protest could have. Her poise revealed that she had been expecting this moment, perhaps even rehearsing it, and he suddenly grasped how deep and careful the conspiracy against him had been. By afternoon, carriages crunched down the muddy drive, as Willowbrook filled with neighbors and curious onlookers, all invited under Aldrich's name by Philippe and Henri. Word spread that he was staging an unusual display of Christian charity, elevating one of his servants to the dignity of wife. Some came anticipating a joke, others prepared to witness the eccentricity of a man whose gambling losses had finally unhinged him. Instead, they were met with a carefully arranged wedding flowers, food, music, and a minister in clerical robes ready to officiate. Aldrich, dressed in his best coat and polished boots, played his part with brittle desperation. He repeated the story of a sudden religious awakening and his duty to act with Christian benevolence. Most of the guests, while puzzled, nodded politely. In the strange world of antebellum Louisiana, even scandal could be softened, if cloaked in the language of piety. Then Celeste appeared. She wore a plain but well-tailored gown that fit her broad frame with surprising elegance. At 38, she was older than most brides, and heavier than the delicate bells of Plantation society. Yet her bearing silenced the whispers. She carried herself with a calm dignity, smiling warmly, thanking those present as though she truly believed she was being honored. Her presence disarmed the crowd more effectively than any explanation Aldrich had stammered. The minister, deep in debt and well compensated for his compliance, read the vows with measured solemnity. When he asked if any objected, a ripple of unease moved through the room, but no one raised their voice. To do so would have meant challenging not just Aldrich, but the veneer of Christian charity he had draped over the event. Aldrich's reply was barely audible, his lips moving around vows that sounded more like defeat than devotion. Celeste's answers, in contrast, rang out clear and steady. She promised to love, honor, and obey with such conviction that the ceremony seemed for a moment almost ordinary, as if this grotesque arrangement had always been inevitable. The kiss that sealed the ceremony was brief, chaste, and devastating. When the minister urged Aldrich to kiss his bride, the planter nearly fainted. His lips trembled, his face drained of color, and for a moment it seemed he might collapse entirely. But Celeste steadied him, lifting herself to meet him halfway. That single quiet gesture carried the weight of finality. It was the moment his public life ended and his private torment began. When the guests drifted away, whispering in confusion at what they had just seen, Aldrich was left alone with the woman who now bore his name. The great house that had once symbolized his triumph felt strange and menacing, its familiar rooms distorted by the reality of his new marriage. Celeste moved through Willowbrook with calm authority, rearranging furniture, giving orders to staff, taking up space that had always been his alone. When Aldrich weakly objected, she met his eyes with cold fury and said, "We're married now, Jeremiah. Husband and wife partners. I think it's time we started acting like it, don't you?" The quiet venom in her words froze him more effectively than a shout ever could. That first night when she joined him in the bed that had once been his sanctuary, Aldrich grasped the genius of his enemy's design. They had trapped him in a prison of flesh and memory, forcing him to share every day, every meal, every night, with the embodiment of his guilt and his ruin. Celeste needed no chains to torment him. Her presence was enough. And yet what Aldrich could not know was that this marriage was not the end game. It was only the beginning. The first month passed in deceptive calm. To the outside world, Willowbrook still functioned. Celeste managed the staff with steady hands, welcomed callers with polite warmth, and maintained the illusion of a functioning household. Some neighbors even whispered grudging admiration for her composure. But Aldrich felt the cracks forming. His coffee in the mornings had developed a bitter edge. His suppers left him queasy and faint. He suffered headaches that pulsed like hot iron and dizziness that sent him grasping at the walls. At first he blamed stress, humiliation, the unbearable shame of living under the thumb of his enemies. But as the weeks passed and his body weakened, fear crept in. The breaking point came when he collapsed mid-conversation with prospective cotton buyers. Dr. Hamilton Warren, the family physician who had tended Willowbrook for years, examined him with grave concern. "Your condition is quite serious, Mr. Aldrich," he said as he packed away his instruments. "These symptoms suggest chronic poisoning, likely arsenic or something similar. It builds slowly, month after month, until the victim is too weak to resist." In that instant, Aldrich realized the terrible truth. Celeste's gentle smile, her efficient household management, her flawless meals. They were all part of the slow execution Philippe and Henri had promised. Death had been invited into his home wearing a wedding gown, and it was feeding him poison, one bite at a time. The doctor's words left no room for doubt. Without immediate removal from the source, the poisoning would be fatal. For Jeremiah Aldrich, it was confirmation of the horror he had already begun to suspect Celeste, his wife in name. But executioner in practice was killing him with the same patient precision Philippe and Henri had used to strip away his fortune and reputation. She wasn't rushing the job. Each dose was measured subtle, carefully, hidden in food and drink so that his death would look natural, even inevitable, to anyone not searching for foul play. But Aldrich knew that accusing her would be worse than useless. Legally, she was his wife, shielded by the very contract he had signed to save his own life. Socially, she appeared the image of loyalty and composure. And in truth, she was untouchable, backed by the sons of his murdered partners, who now owned his debts, his plantation, and his fate. If he accused Celeste, she would deny it. Philippe and Henri would silence him permanently, so he turned to desperate precautions. He began sneaking into the kitchen at night to prepare meals himself using pots and knives hidden in his study, and ate only what he had cooked with his own hands. He drank only from a private well on the edge of the property that Celeste never touched. At night he locked himself in a guest room, refusing to share the marital bed where she might strike while he slept. For a few weeks, the symptoms eased, and Aldrich thought he might have slowed her campaign. But the cost of survival was exposure. Visitors to Willowbrook noticed his gaunt face, his twitchy mannerisms, his refusal to touch the meals his wife so lovingly prepared. They whispered that the humiliation of his marriage had broken his mind. Neighbors shook their heads, speculating that Jeremiah Aldrich was unraveling under stress. Celeste, meanwhile, played her part to perfection. She fretted over him in front of guests, sighing with patient sorrow at his refusals. She laid out sumptuous dishes he wouldn't touch and poured wine he refused to drink. To onlookers, she was a wife bewildered and wounded by her husband's descent into paranoia. The brilliance of the performance was devastating. His caution looked like madness. His suspicion seemed like cruelty. His attempts to explain the truth to Dr. Warren to old associates were dismissed as the ramblings of a disgraced man cracking under shame. No one could believe that a black woman who had only recently lived in bondage could devise such a subtle, sophisticated plan, let alone acquire poisons and administer them with scientific patience. By late spring of 1854, Aldrich was trapped in the cruelest prison imaginable. His knowledge of Celeste's true intentions became proof in the eyes of others that he had gone insane. Each day she killed him slowly, smiling softly while society nodded and concluded that Jeremiah Aldrich was simply losing his mind. Every precaution Aldrich took, every frantic effort to shield himself, only reinforced the image of a man losing his grip on reality. To his neighbors, he was no longer a cunning plantation master, but a paranoid wreck unraveling under the weight of his own eccentric marriage. That was precisely what Philippe and Henri had intended. Their vengeance was never meant to end with physical pain alone. It was designed to strip him of dignity, erode every friendship, and leave him to die. Not just poisoned, but abandoned, disgraced, and convinced that fate itself had turned against him. The cruelest blow came at a dinner party Celeste arranged to mark their 3-month anniversary. Invitations went out in Aldrich's name to the handful of neighbors who still tolerated Willowbrook's strange household, along with Dr. Warren and a few other figures of local standing. Aldrich, ever paranoid, tried to outwit his wife by eating in secret beforehand and swearing he would touch nothing at the table. But Celeste had prepared her stage too well. With a smile, she unveiled a bottle of wine she claimed had been aging in the cellar for years, a relic she wished to open in honor of their union. She had it uncorked before everyone's eyes, poured into spotless glasses, and raised hers in a toast. In that moment, Aldrich was trapped. To refuse the drink would be to expose his madness to all, confirming every rumor that he had lost touch with reality. So he raised the glass hands trembling and met Celeste's gaze across the table. For an instant, her mask slipped, and in her eyes he saw not love or loyalty, but the cold, satisfied hunger of a predator who had waited a decade for this moment. The poison acted swiftly. Within minutes, his stomach knotted with violent cramps, his throat burned, and his breath came in ragged gasps. He collapsed against the table, clutching his chest as his guests cried out in shock. To them, it looked like the inevitable collapse of a man already weakened by months of stress and decline. Dr. Warren rushed forward, but Celeste's theatrics, her sobbing, her desperate pleas, her clinging to her husband's body, made treatment nearly impossible. She played the grieving wife so convincingly that neighbors focused on soothing her instead of aiding Aldrich. As the life drained from him, Celeste bent close and whispered into his ear. Her words were the final, merciless revelation. Marcus Devo was my cousin Jeremiah. Samuel Rochelle was my uncle by marriage. I've been working with Philippe and Henri since 1845, waiting to watch you die the way you made them die, slowly, painfully, and utterly alone. The truth struck harder than the poison itself. Celeste had not been a pawn forced into service, but a blood relative of the men Aldrich had betrayed, a co-conspirator who had lived beside him in silence, feeding him, smiling at him, watching him weaken, while savoring each step of his collapse. He died not simply at the hands of his enemies, but in the arms of a wife who had always been family to the ghosts he thought buried. Every word, every smile, every carefully staged moment of domestic life had been part of Celeste's performance. Her patient theater designed to squeeze every ounce of suffering from Jeremiah Aldrich before the poison finally claimed him. As he gasped for breath and his vision narrowed to black, he could still hear her voice rising above the chaos, sobbing for God's mercy, pleading with Dr. Warren to save her husband, convincing every witness in the room that they were watching a woman's heart break in real time. To his neighbors, it was a tragedy. To Celeste, Philippe, and Henri, it was the triumph of a plan more than a decade in the making. Jeremiah Aldrich died at 9:47 p.m. on June 18, 1854. The official verdict, natural causes linked to nervous exhaustion, the predictable end for a man worn down by financial stress and eccentric choices. His funeral was well attended, with Celeste draped in black, her weeping so convincing that neighboring matrons offered to help her run Willowbrook during her mourning. No one suspected that behind her veil of tears, she was celebrating the completion of one of the most calculated murders in Louisiana's history. Philippe and Henri had planned for more than Aldrich's death. They had mapped out the fate of his legacy. As his lawful widow, Celeste inherited Willowbrook and all its debts. Within weeks, she signed the plantation over to her co-conspirators in exchange for the forgiveness of those obligations. Soon after, she vanished from Louisiana, entirely likely traveling north with enough money to reinvent herself as a free woman, and perhaps in time find the children Aldrich had stolen from her years before. On paper, the whole episode was a curiosity, nothing more. A wealthy planter had shocked his peers by marrying a slave, then collapsed and died months later under the strain of poor health. The matter became a footnote in local lore, the sort of eccentric tale neighbors repeated with a shake of the head and a rueful smile. But whispered stories told in New Orleans parlors and plantation kitchens preserved the darker truth that Aldrich had been undone by the sons of the men he betrayed, aided by a woman who had lost everything to his greed. That version of the story, passed down in secret, was not one of madness or misfortune, but of patience, blood ties, and vengeance. It was a warning whispered across generations: never assume that the dead rest quietly, and never underestimate the reach of family determined to balance the scales. Devo and Henri Rochelle had accomplished something no Southern jury would have dared, and no judge would have allowed. They had prosecuted a murder in a society built to shield men like Jeremiah Aldrich, carried out a death sentence the law would never enforce, and done it with such precision that no evidence ever pointed back to them. Their revenge was more than personal. It was a masterpiece of patience, calculation, and a deep understanding of how Louisiana's wealth and power really worked. The ultimate proof of their planning came in what they did with Willowbrook. Instead of cashing out and selling it off, they turned Aldrich's plantation into a sanctuary for freed and escaped slaves. The grand house that once hosted Louisiana's elite became a hidden station on the Underground Railroad, quietly moving people toward freedom in the North and Canada. It was an act of poetic justice. Aldrich's fortune, built on flesh and blood, was repurposed into a weapon against the very system he had embodied. Perhaps the most devastating piece of their revenge, though, was how completely they erased him. Aldrich left no monuments, no proud descendants, no glowing tributes in the local histories. His wealth went to the families of the men he betrayed. His property was turned to causes he would have despised. His reputation collapsed under the weight of his own humiliations rather than public exposure of his crimes. To the outside world, he was nothing more than a ruined planter who married unwisely and died of poor health, a cautionary tale, not a legacy. He was not remembered as a criminal mastermind, not even as a victim of revenge, but as a man who vanished into obscurity. In a society that had protected him at every turn, his enemies found a way to make him disappear so completely that history itself forgot he ever mattered. And maybe that's the most chilling part of all, that justice, when denied by the courts, can still find other paths. Justice that waits, justice that adapts, justice that turns a man's own pride and power into the tools of his destruction. What do you think? Was the full truth ever uncovered, or are there still secrets buried at Willowbrook Plantation? Let us know in the comments. If this story left you unsettled, share it with someone who loves dark mysteries. Hit the like button to support the channel, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next tale of history's hidden horrors.